right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and I am joined by Father Moses McPherson. How you doing today, sir?
Good, man.
So we're going to be diving into some of the videos that you've posted on your YouTube channel. It's really been blowing up, and it's great to see. And your links are all in the video description for anybody watching now or in the future. If you want to find Father Moses's YouTube channel, along with his Instagram and his X, are also in the video description. But I don't know if it's viral, but for an Orthodox priest, you posted a 13-minute video on boys becoming men, and it's got like over 80,000 views.
Yeah, thank God. Yeah, it's done really well. I mean, I think it's reaching a lot of people, resonates. So
yeah, I saw that when you first posted it, and I reached out to you. I was like, hey, Father, I think it was right after you posted the next video on girls becoming godly women. And I was like, would you love to speak on that topic? And then I just looked today when I was grabbing your links. That's like over 80,000. Now your channel's over 11,000 subs. So anybody watching, go subscribe to Father Moses, support the great content that he's putting out. And we're going to be talking about the theme that kind of undergirds some of your videos is the failure to mature. I titled the stream Adult Children. And this is something that I spoke on, and we've mentioned actually together in previous streams about the sort of failure to maturate. And there's a technical term that I wanted to give to people, and I wanted to begin by discussing neoteny. And neoteny is just a scientific term for sort of the juvenilization of different animal species, and that the retainment of juvenile characteristics. And so one example would be like pigs. You keep a pig in a pen and it has pink skin, it's hairless, it has no tusks, this type of thing. But you let it go out into the wild and its phenotype begins to change. It begins to mature. And so our genetic phenotype and the way that it's displayed changes based on our environments. And I was curious to open up the conversation. What are some of the things that you think in contemporary society are retaining juvenile characteristics?
That's a good question. What are the things in culture that are encouraging people?
Yeah. So, for example, I think, and I'm not against all video games. I'm not against having fun with friends, but certainly a overemphasis on playing video games and accomplishing goals in games, I think, is one juvenile characteristic. We've seen low testosterone. So I was with Dr. Mo. We were just talking recently about testosterone. And so that's obviously multiple factors in our society are limiting testosterone. But because of that, the width of shoulders, the development of young men is being altered. That's a sort of retention of juvenile characteristics. But I got in trouble with Nick Fuentes and the Groypers a couple years ago. I got blocked because I highlighted the neotenous characteristics of their movement, talking about chalky milk, eating chicken nuggies, referring to women's breasts as mommy milkers, and how they're talking about transforming the political landscape of America, and yet then participate in all this sort of neotenous juvenile behavior patterns. And I'm curious what you think.
Well, I mean, even if you, and this is not a dig, but if you look at somebody like Nick, I mean, he's got the physical form of a 13-year-old boy. I mean, he does. I mean, that's not a dig. I mean, again, you could say, like, he doesn't have a beard. That there may be a genetic component to that, which is reality. I couldn't grow a beard till I was 30 years old. Okay. Right. So like, if you see pictures of me when I got married, I was 20. I'm like baby face. I look like I'm 12, like just reality. But doing something like not being active, not lifting weights, not maturing your body, that's a decision, right? So like, that's not a put. If somebody goes, oh, that's a put down. It's like, if he chooses to present himself as a kind of almost borderline prepubescent male, and that's how he wants to look and be received, then it's going to be natural that he's not going to be received by men. His audience is not men. His audience is teenage and early 20s boys.
Right.
And he's not married. I mean, he's not married. He doesn't have a wife. He doesn't have children. I mean, when people talk about furthering the country through making these life decisions and doing these things, you actually have to do that.
Right.
You actually have to produce children. If you're not producing children and you say the answer is producing children, you should maybe stop preaching and start living. And then later on, you can say, look, this is what I did that was effective, because it's much harder. It's easy to say these things, much harder to live them. So,
Right.
and I don't mean that like, again, I don't think that he's stunted and he can't exercise. Like, he can exercise. He actively chooses not to. So to me, that's one of those things that happens where we don't embrace the discomfort or the suffering or what we don't like about exercise.
Right.
Right. And so the carryover to that mentally is that we become unequipped to deal with adversity because we don't force ourselves into any adversity. We don't build a masculine physique, right? It's hugely
Right.
problematic.
Right.
Because it's our responsibility to be a protector, provider, and a priest to the people around us. Anyways, there's all these kind of dynamics. I wouldn't say that it's any one thing in our society. I would say it's so out of whack. So I would say, like, is video games a big deal? I personally don't think so. I don't think it's a big issue to play an hour a day or do whatever, chill out, whatever.
Sure.
The problem becomes when it's like 6 hours.
Right.
Right. Or, it's like if somebody says, oh, I personally don't like Star Wars. I don't like any of that garbage pretty much. But if somebody says, oh, I really like Star Wars and I kind of get lost in the whatever fantasy of Star Wars and I enjoy that, that's fine. It's fine for them to like it. If you're buying a bunch of like toys and you have a display case full of toys, there's a maturation process that's not happening there. And I think part of this also has to do with the fact that it's like an echo chamber. And I notice this a lot on Twitter, which is you get a lot of guys who are unmarried, don't spend time with women, don't know how to interact with women, and they only interact with other men. And so all of their development is about being with other basically young celibate males. And these are not men. And so you end up in this echo chamber. So you need to expose yourself. That would be the number one thing that I would say is, like, as a young man, especially 18 to 23, 24, you need to overexpose yourself to being with men. And so what does that look like? Well, you find guys in the church. You find guys that you can admire. And then because this is the thing, when you're in your 18 to 23 or 25 or whatever frame, there's one thing that you have an abundance of time, right? That time is going to be gone later on because it's going to be eaten up by all the people who take the time from you because they require the time. But when you're in that framework, you have two things. You have tons of time and you have loads of energy. Right. And so one of the things that I did when I was in my early mid-20s is I went to go work for a friend of mine who was in his late 30s at the time and had 4 kids. And I spent loads of time with his family. So if he was doing something like a project, whatever else, I would volunteer my time just to spend time with him so that I could be around him, so that I could kind of infuse into me just being around an older man and retaining from him and getting from him, what it was that he had. And one of the things that I realized, like, he didn't talk a lot of trash, right? He didn't really talk trash. He didn't make crude jokes. He didn't act silly. You know what I mean? So he carried himself in a very mature way. And so you could see by osmosis, really hanging out with him, oh, if I do these things, he doesn't find them entertaining. Interesting, right?
Right.
And so sometimes I notice that with guys like in their early 20s is they'll be around other guys in their early 20s and they'll be around me and they'll say some, I don't know, just some silly jokes, whatever else. They laugh and I just stand there. And it's not like I'm not being mean. It's just not entertaining. I'm not a man in my early 20s. It's not interesting to me. It's just not funny to me. But I think what it does is it begins to infuse them with a sense of like, oh, okay, I'm moving on. This is what a more mature man looks like.
Right.
And, there's that verse from St. Paul. He says, when I was a boy, I thought like a boy, right? I acted like a boy. Now that I am a man, I've put childish things behind me.
Right.
And so when you are with, when you're with a guy, like let's just say you take your guy from church, he's in his early 30s, he's got 2 to 4 kids, whatever else. He's got stress, he's got a stay-at-home wife, he's got a full-time job, he's got kids, he's never raised kids before. And you just say, hey man, if you're doing yard work, I'll come and do it with you. If you guys are doing a family dinner and you can have me over sometime, I'd love to just be around you and your kids. I'd love to give a hand. I'd love to be around, blah, 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 blah. And you are a giver, and you're somebody who can be an asset. Those guys are like, great, come over on Saturday, dude. I got a ton of yard work to do. We'll do yard work and then we'll hang out and drink beer afterwards or do whatever. Or like,
right.
We'll take the kids to the park or do something, blah, 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 blah. So anyways, like I did a lot of that stuff in my early to mid 20s. One of the things I would say too is I don't think I really launched as an adult until probably 27, 28. Like I meet guys in my church who are way beyond where I was at when I was their age. Right. I was not career minded in my early 20s. I was going to college, getting a philosophy degree, which was worthless. It was, doing the double major, philosophy and religion, both worthless. Essentially, you know what I mean? I had no career aspirations. I was married and I was actively preventing having children. So I didn't have that responsibility, right?
Right.
So when I was getting into my mid 20s through a series of events, this is the big thing that I realized was like, I need to be around men because my own father didn't instill manliness in me. And I need to learn how to mature and grow up. And I do think that there's a sense in which I often refer to it, and forgive me, because it's just, I'm going to give you my best take on it without really developed language. But I've often noticed over the years, you get a certain relationship with your dad, but then you almost need a relationship with another man who kind of gives you your man card. So there's a certain point where like other men start to affirm you and say like, you're a man. And like, that's when you really become a man.
Right.
When other men look at you and go, you're a man, that is a quintessential kind of turning point in your development. And what are the things that we're talking about when we're talking about men? We're talking about not being given over to our emotions, living by principles. Dude, look at the things that I look for in the guys in the church. Being consistent.
Yep.
Just showing up to the services, all the services, right?
Yep.
Being helpful, like working hard. You know what I mean? Like just the sweat equity. Those are the things that when you are around other men and you see another man and you're like, man, that guy's hardworking, he automatically has your respect.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? I often comment on this, but like when you have a work day at church and you got like 5, 6, 7 guys busting their butt working, there's always 3 or 4 guys talking about church history or something else, and they're not working. Like it's inevitable. And like I can tell you, like that is not manly behavior. Like nobody wants to know what you think about whatever controversy or theological point or whatever else. Like if we're mixing concrete, all I want you to do is mix concrete because that's what I'm doing, right? And it's not fun. But
that's one of the things about being at a small parish like myself is whenever there's manual labor that needs to be done, is they often recruit me and some of the other guys. So we're out of necessity, which is again a sort of finding your
we're here for.
Yeah, finding your place and responsibility in a community. But regarding some of the general themes that you were mentioning, the gentleman that's in our thumbnail, we have our faces, and then the guy in front, and he's kind of a meme because he was crying when Star Wars came out, and he watched the trailer for Star Wars, and he was in tears. And I agree with you. I don't think video games per se are one of the, crucial ills of our society. A lot of people use it to blow off steam. I like to watch sports. Last night was the Stanley Cup. So once I got done with my work, that, I watched the Stanley Cup and then go to bed. But the focus on juvenile things, because you're talking about Paul in Corinthians, when you're a boy, you focus on boyish things. Once you become a man, you put away those and you focus on new topics, new responsibilities. And it seems like the the sort of archetype you were portraying, the person that's surrounded by action figures and Funko Pops and memorabilia from Star Wars. This is neoteny. This is juvenile, because you can see that the focus of the individual is still on these things that have really no ultimate meaning for other people.
Well, and it's the fantasy, right? So like we have a mental disability, all of us, in the fact that we are drawn to fantasy. And this is one of the things that the fathers tell us. And one of the reasons that we struggle with the Jesus prayer is to acquire a I don't know what I'm trying to think about the word, but a non-fantasy life, a life based in reality, not based in fantasy type thinking. When we see these people who are obsessed with these things, they're obsessed with the fantasy.
Right.
And it's really right. So when you're a boy and you're daydreaming of being a Jedi, I guess, if that's what you were into when you were, I watched Conan the Barbarian when I was like a kid, which is not healthy. That's not normal.
No, it's not healthy, but I did love Conan. Yeah, Arnold
that's
and
not
Conan.
normal, but that's what I was. But let's say you're a kid and you dream of being a Jedi. There's something normalish to that, in the fact that you want some kind of spectacular journey, whatever else in your life. You mature into high school realizing like, this is fun, this is a fantasy, this is a story.
Right.
When you're in your 20s and 30s and you dress up and go to an amusement park and like swing a fake lightsaber around, like that's brutal. Like that is brutal. Like there's something, there are developmental milestones that were not reached.
Right.
And again, you know, like you said, I think the big thing with all of us men have a propensity to cut loose. And if you look at video games or sports or a movie or whatever else, all of that has to do with the fact that most of us, when we're working hard or driving ourselves hard, get mentally exhausted and need a period of the day to kind of turn our brain off and do something. It's not about, I think, turning our brain off that's the problem.
Right.
Because it's very hard not to have some form of kind of just mental break. Yeah, like lifting weights for me is a mental break.
Agreed.
But the thing is that, yes, it comes down to the quantity. And that's where I think it gets really wacky when somebody's like, oh, I'm playing whatever, 6 hours of Call of Duty or something. It's like, that's a lot of time. Like, that's a lot of time. Like, that's, you know what I mean? That's not normal. Like an hour, maybe 2 hours. Like I could see something like that if you had the time, if everything else was done and you kind of earned it. It's not the end of the world. You know what I'm saying?
Agreed.
But yeah.
But when you're bringing up fantasy, and that connects with, I just did a stream a few days ago on the Netflix documentary of Ashley Madison, Sex, Lies, and Scandal, talking about Ashley Madison, the dating website for married people. And what came out and how fantasy relates to it is that it was supposed to be 60-40 men to women ratio on the website. And the whole claim to fame was all these women that they had on the site. Well, it turned out in the docuseries is that there's only about 10% of actual women on the site, and they were all bots. And some of them were run by AI, and the others were run by employees of Ashley Madison that would engage in these conversations with married men. And they would spend thousands and thousands of dollars. And it shows you that, and this was one of the questions I brought up as just something for people to reflect on, is that one of the things I think men need to be cautious of as adults is living in a fantasy world. And for these men, it was a sexual fantasy. And you talked in your video on lust about the logismy, the mental images of the demonic attacks. And so if you're living in a fantasy world of sexual fulfillment or sexual excitement or a perception of oneself that doesn't accord with reality or where you actually stand amongst other people, I think that's a major detriment for men. And so maybe the Ashley Madison thing isn't necessarily related to neoteny or the failure to mature. In a way it is, because it's the failure to take on responsibility of the marriage that they've aligned with. But I'm curious what your thoughts on just the problem of contemporary society constantly trying to get us to live in a fantasy world. I mean, that's where they want us, it feels, to live the majority of our lives, is in through the propaganda, through the social media, through the YouTube videos, through this sort of fantasy world that really is sort of divorced from reality.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is like it's just plugging into a baseline. There's a baseline desire there in all of us.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with food. I mean, it's like, why can you not find any quality food to eat? Like, I mean, seriously, like if you're out and you're like, man, I could just go for something that was healthy. Like I mean, unless you have like a local restaurant or something else, like there's nothing healthy. Like
Right.
none of the fast food is healthy. It's all degrees of poison, basically. And it's like, well, why is that? And it's like, because we are perpetually given over to kind of our base desires. And that's one of the things that, is a proclivity of ours. And
Right.
so, yeah, I mean, I think in a way, the reason that society is like that is because of the fact that it's easy to engage. It's the same reason that they find with news, right? When they get with news and they say, negative news generates like way more interaction than positive news. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like that's the reality. Because people would rather feel angry than feel like happy and content. They just would, because it's more natural to them.
Right.
So,
well, in your video on lust, I thought it was great because you were talking about, again, not engaging in the mental temptations and the imagination. And I talk about this all the time, that being the sort of battleground that as Orthodox Christians, and I've talked with so many Protestants that have converted or even New Age, and that was a huge thing that reoriented their perception of the spiritual life, was realizing that the imagination is actually the battleground, and that all the temptation begins there. And they never interpreted that way or never even thought that way. And in people coming from the psychedelics and the New Age, they divinize the imagination as anything that's coming through there is coming from source.
The dream life, right? Interpreting dreams, which we pay no attention to. I mean, I've had a million conversations with people who are like, start telling me their dreams. I'm like, no, we ignore dreams. And they're like, yeah, but this dream was very, I'm like, no, I don't.
Yeah, it was so vivid, Father.
Yeah. Like, I don't think you understand. Like, we do not value dreams. We don't put any stock in them.
But Daniel interpreted dreams.
Yeah. Oh no, it's a real thing. It's a real pitfall for people.
Right. So could you speak to lust? And this is a huge, obviously, problem and stumbling block for young men, me included. And I thought you did a great job of actually talking about how much of the desires are natural. The point is getting back and falling into temptation with the fantasy of one way or another, and lusting. But I'm curious, I wanted you to speak to lust as the problem for so many young men, but in a way, how it also keeps them in a juvenile state.
Yeah. So let's work it backwards. I mean, number one is, the one thing you hit on, which is true, which is it's essentially everything is against us. Everything is physiologically, what do you want to say, stacked against us, right? As long as your body is producing testosterone in just even normal quantities, it's going to be a temptation, because that's what the hormones in your body are driving you to. Right. And there's so many of these funny, anecdotal stories about women, who get on testosterone and have the, you know what I mean? Like I can't give too much details, but there was somebody I was talking with one time, and it was not church related, and he was pretty fit dude in his 50s. And I asked him, I said, are you doing TRT or whatever else? And he's like, yeah. He goes, my wife got on a low dose of TRT or low dose of testosterone because her hormones were out of whack. And he says, man, I was like hiding from her. He goes, it was too much, man. It was too much. He said, I had to get on the testosterone just to get back to a normal, healthy level, because I couldn't handle it. And I was like dying laughing. But there's so many of these funny stories, because women think like, well, some women think, well, not all, but some women think, well, men have so much of a sex drive and they don't realize that it's like, if you even had half of the testosterone that men have, you would understand that there's a very strong natural component that is compelling men.
Right.
You know what I mean? I think when I've heard different things, when people kind of rattle off different things in the church about fasting or other things, there are certainly people who are able to do those things. But there's also a lot of men in the church that you encounter that just have normal, healthy levels of testosterone that are not in their 50s. And they're like, Father, I'm struggling. You know what I
Right.
mean? And it's like, well, yes, because you have, even if they're not doing anything sideways with it, even if they're not doing anything bad, they still have a natural desire that is physically compelling them forward. So that's where this whole thing starts and becomes very tricky, which is you have to be doing battle against yourself. It's not, I mean, as much as everyone kind of blames the internet or blames this industry or that, it's like 90% of the problem starts within ourselves as men.
Right.
It just is. And the thing is, it's not even a bad desire. That's the other thing. It's like, it's not a bad desire. It's the misuse of that desire. So what do I see when I see men? There's a couple things. I was going to do a video on this, but I could talk a little bit on it. Number one is I find men, when they get into lust, become very neurotic in their thinking. They actually start to think more like women. And that's not a dig on women. Women's minds work a certain way that's very distinct from men.
Right.
But women tend to have some pitfalls that they struggle with that are different or unique to their gender. One of which is that they tend to overanalyze. They get analysis by paralysis.
Yeah.
And they become kind of neurotic and begin to kind of spin in their thinking. This is not their analytical thinking look, it's not the strongest characteristic for women. Women have lots of strong characteristics. This is not misogyny. This is not putting them down. This is simply to say that in this particular area, when it comes to analytical thinking, women are benefited by the help of their husband. Likewise, men are not great at emotional deduction and figuring out what is happening with other people emotionally, and women are brilliant at this, right? So we each have strengths and weaknesses that we have to help each other along with. So one of the things that I see, though, is that men lose kind of their confidence. They become very kind of neurotic and insecure. Part of that is because of the fact with pornography, there's a couple things. I mean, number one is, forgive me, we're going to be blunt, but number one is they're constantly looking at other men's penises.
Yeah.
That's just bizarre. That's very, very strange behavior, right? Number two is they are creating a fantasy world where they are getting sexual attention from women that is not in reality.
Right.
So in the fantasy of their mind, they're getting these attractive women. The reality is they would stand no chance with them. So there's this real strong cognitive dissonance that's happening in their mind where they're beginning to think, oh, in my brain, I am, so whatever. These women want to be with me. These women are showing me attention. And then the letdown in real society and interactions is women are spectacularly not into you at all. And so the thing is, right, one of the things that I've realized when I was young, that, because I was interested in women, was I was like, oh, you have to modify aspects of who you are in order to be more appealing to women. That's what you do if you want to win at this game. But we've lost that because the guys are like, no, the women should all just be into me. And it's like, no, that's like, that is not how it works. Like, they genuinely think you're pathetic because you are pathetic. That's what it is. They see, no, like, that's not a, and again, like, people go, oh my goodness, Father. It's like, this is actually, I'm just telling you what people are actually thinking. This is not like, I'm not making this up or putting people down. I'm just saying, like, when women meet a guy at coffee hour and he sits there and wants to rattle on for 15 minutes about some obscure thing that has nothing to do or any interest with them, they are completely and utterly uninterested and turned off by that guy.
Right.
That guy can say, well, I'm the most interesting guy at coffee hour. Or he can say, this is not really how women communicate or connect. This is acceptable when I go and hang out with the fellas and we want to debate World War III and European tactics in, Ukraine or whatever. But this is not a conversation starter for the young ladies in the parish.
Right.
I mean, it's just not, right?
No,
So,
I've seen the same thing multiple times.
Oh, it's brutal.
There was a young man who was able to sit down and talk with the cute girl at the parish that he had interest in, and the first thing he went to was like Orthodox theology and patristics. And we had a one-on-one. I was telling him, like, brother, like, that's not what you want to talk with a woman about. Like, for you and me, for other guys, yeah, we love that topic, but you got to talk with something that connects with her and her like daily life, something that she has interest in. And he just didn't know how to bridge his own interest with like communication with a woman that she would also find interesting.
Well, and that's the thing, is like, you don't have to be interested in the things that you're talking to women about all the time. You just have to understand that they find it interesting. Right? I mean, that's part of, like, you know what I mean? Like, if my wife says, oh, it's the end of the day, I want to talk for, 20 minutes about homeschooling, like, I guarantee you that's still not interesting to me. But I love my wife, so I fully am available for her to talk about whatever homeschooling piece of information that she finds important. That's what you do, right? That's the development. I think what happens with guys is they're in the fantasy getting all these women that are out of their reach. The reality is brutal on them because they're not getting any interest at all. And they're actually getting negative feedback, which is even more painful, which then causes them to, you know what I mean? Like, forgive me, but kind of tuck tail and cry and run back to the pornography as a way of soothing. Coping a lot of times with most of the guys that I've been very, very blessed to help some people with this issue over the years. The number one issue is that men are using it to mitigate and regulate their feelings. So they're stressed, they're overwhelmed about life, they don't like their feelings, they don't like what happened, whatever else. They have a negative feeling and they go, you know what? I want to replace it with a good, positive feeling. Then they commit the sin and then they feel worse.
Right. Every time.
So the thing is when you're talking with them, you're like, well, you're not really replacing a negative feeling with a positive feeling. Right. You're not doing that. It's only a temporary source of quote unquote enjoyment, which it really is lost once the sin is committed.
Yeah.
Because it's still sin. So what is part of the dilemma is like, yes, you have to learn as a man to be uncomfortable and to accept uncomfortable feelings.
Right. Well, you mentioned this in your video on why boys fail to become men, and the big message that you had, which I thought was so insightful, and people don't speak on this as specifically as you did in that video, is the controlling of your emotions. Yeah. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more on to this, the maturation from a boy to a teenager to a man, is that it's not that you're not going to experience negative emotions or you're not going to experience trauma, but part of it is once you mature and once you grow up is compartmentalizing that trauma, those emotions, and being able to deal with it in an effective way without it taking over you as a person.
Yeah, I think the thing is that we tend to run from it when we're younger, and we actually have to learn how to turn around, face it, and actually lean into it. And accept it for what it is. You know what I mean? Like, your boss chews you out at work. Like, nobody likes that experience, right?
Right.
So that's a negative. It provokes negative emotions. What kind of negative emotions? Well, it provokes insecurity because you're like, oh man, I could lose my job, or he criticized me, or I'm not going to get a raise, or like it made me look bad in front of my coworkers, whatever else, right? So we want to avoid that emotion. So then we start to think about ways to mitigate that emotion, which is we go, well, he's a jerk, or he did this because of this, or he doesn't understand, right? So we start to put him down in our mind in order to make ourselves feel better. And so again, we're still in that cycle of trying to get rid of the negative emotions. We really have to mature to the point where when people get upset with us, whatever else, we're like, it's okay. Like, I just accept it. Like, I accept that people, I accept. Why do you think old people are so emotionally more stable? It's because they've gone through it a million times and they realize they really don't care. Like, they do not care. Like, they stop caring. I remember there's a funny story. My mom's friend was out to eat, and with so it was my mom's friend was out to eat with her mom, and her mom was starting to steal the fajita pan at the restaurant, put it in her purse. And she was like, "Mom, you can't steal the fajita pan." She's like, "The food wasn't good tonight." She's like, "I'm taking the fajita pan." And she's like, "You can't do that." That's some crazy stuff that only an old person would think, because they're like, I don't care. Like, they become like we go, oh, they're like savages. They're not like savages. They've just moved past the point of caring what other people think about them. So when that's actually called humility. Like, that's actual real humility. When the person who gets dunked on and insulted lashes out and freaks out and says, I can't believe people talk about me like this, it's all ego. It's all pride. When you're just like, I just really don't care, it doesn't matter to me, like it just doesn't matter, that's a sign of humility. Well, what are you accepting? You're like, well, some people like me and some people won't.
Right.
And sometimes I'll get the good end and sometimes I won't. You know what I mean? Sometimes I'll get the carrot and sometimes I'll get the stick. And that's life. Right. And I think you have to go through a lot of that and actually turn and face the feelings and accept that life is what it is and people are who they are. Right. And I think even on a deeper level, the more you mature, you begin to see where other people are at in their life and you begin to value the things that you have. So like one thing I would say is like, I value my marriage probably, like, of all human relationships, I value my marriage the most by far. I likewise value what my wife thinks about me. Why? Right. Because she's my most important person. So like, I know that I have a good marriage, and I know that there are people, you know, for whatever reason will not like me or like my personality or the way that I say or do things or whatever else. I'm okay with that.
Well, that's part of, though, that you've already prioritized what's most important in your life, which is part of maturity, right? So
yes,
your wife's opinion is more important because of the hierarchy of value that you've already established and have deemed most important for your life as a man. And yes. Again, maybe the juvenile characteristic here is that some people don't have their priorities in order, and so they're being totally affected by things that really are meaningless ultimately.
Well, and I think a lot of times when you're young, you have a lot of pride. And when I was young, I was like, everybody has to treat me with respect. And I was like indignant if somebody didn't treat me with respect. Like, to the point where I was like, would be willing to fight them if they weren't respectful.
Right.
You start to mature and realize it doesn't really matter what they think of me.
Right.
And I don't need my ego validated by everybody around me. If somebody doesn't validate who I am, that's okay.
Well, and that relates to one of the takeaways, although you didn't explicitly state it in your video, but I took away is the ability to constrain one's emotions as a sign of male maturity is also related to the lashing out and violence that a lot of men fall victim to, and not realizing, viewing that as a sort of masculine characteristic. Of course, in ways society has deemed a lot of these things as toxic masculinity, but in a way, from an Orthodox perspective, the overly emotional lashing out is toxic immaturity, not masculinity, and that they can't control themselves.
Oh, for sure. 100%. It's ironic because it's actually really bad femininity. I mean, that's what it is.
Right.
I mean, you know that. I mean, this is one of those misnomers. Like when people talk about, not to go down a rabbit hole, but when people talk about roid rage, which I think is mostly just not true, but when people have talked about men becoming too aggressive, whatever else, and you know this from talking to Dr. Michael, I'm sure, but which is, it's not the testosterone, it's the estrogen, right?
Right.
So when the testosterone aromatizes and it elevates the estrogen,
Right.
it's the estrogen that makes men crazy.
Right.
And it's, forgive me, but that's a prevalent hormone that women, experience. It's very, very emotionally intense. It's a very intense emotional hormone. So yeah, but I mean, again, what we're talking about is juvenility, and again, but what are we moving away from? See, there's always this spiritual component. We're moving away from our ego. We're moving away from our pride. We're moving towards more humility. We're moving to stability. You know what I mean? And
Right.
what are those things? Well, you get that from humility.
Right.
You get that from accepting, like, look, not everyone's going to like me. Not everyone's going to respect me. Not everyone's going to say good things about me. That's okay. That's like, I give everybody the right to that. I don't sit there and say, oh, whatever. I'm not like that or something. You know what I'm saying? Like, I
Right.
let people, you got to let people make an assessment of you that isn't always, the most complimentary. And that's okay.
Right. Well, in your video too, one of the things that resonated with me personally and where I'm at in my own life is you were talking about the ability to contain anxiety and view that as not something, again, to run away from, but something in a way to lean into. And in my own life, obviously, I'm going to be getting married here in the next few months, and I'm trying to finish my PhD, and I'm choosing not to pursue a career at the university, but create my own business online. And there's just a lot of unsuredness about the future and uncertainty, how things are going to unfold, and how I'm going to be able to create the goals and the intentions in the life that I want to offer my wife. And that's given me a lot of anxiety recently. And just reflecting that, I mean, laying in bed at night, thinking about the future and thinking about the responsibilities that are getting ready to be on my shoulder. And I want to accomplish them and I want to rise to that challenge. But you were talking that, the anxiety as a man is something, to look at what's causing you anxiety. What are the problems that life is asking you to rise towards? And as Orthodox Christians, to put our faith in God. You mentioned, the Lord's Prayer. What do you have your daily bread for today? Are you doing the things that can be accomplished today? That's what you need to focus on. And it's wonderful for us men to envision the future and work towards these ultimate ends and these ultimate goals. But we can't be consumed, because in a way we're falling back into a fantasy. We're totally focusing on our projection on the future as opposed to like what we can do in the immediate sense.
Yeah, one of the things that I realized with myself and with other people in the church that I counsel and whatnot is negative emotions are pretty much always the byproduct of negative thoughts. So that means that
Yeah.
they're not intrinsic. So they're not an organic experience. There's always a thought process behind them. And our job is to unravel what those negative thoughts are that are leading to the conclusions that are causing us the distress. So,
Right.
like, is it thoughts about the future? Is it thoughts about um, what could happen? Is it uncertainty? Are we in 5 different scenarios that could happen but haven't happened? You know what I mean? And so usually if we can hunt down the thoughts and get the thoughts under control and separate the true from the false, we actually find ourselves much, much, much more emotionally stable,
Right.
because we're not feeding into a bunch of lies and other things. Like, again, when we get into thoughts about the future, the undergirding uncertainty is God going to help me or not? And we don't have an answer for that. We
Right.
don't, because it's the future and you don't have an answer. So you're like, well, where can I rest? You're like, I can rest in today.
Right.
The future is going to be whatever it is. Like, I may start a business and it's not that God isn't with me, but it may not be successful for a whole host of reasons and decisions that have nothing to do with God.
Right.
Right. And so if I'm sitting there and I go, man, I have anxiety about starting this business, it's like, that may not be a bad feeling, right? Like
Right.
a certain measure of anxiety may be healthy, but I need to balance it by saying, you know what? I'm not sure what's going to happen, but have I done my due diligence? Have I made wise decisions? Am I praying and asking God to bless it? And if so, with all of those things, am I now taking the necessary steps in today that are under my control? And
Right.
one of the things I've noticed about people who are constantly in anxiety is that they view everything as a hypothetical that's out of their control. And
That's a great point.
if you think like that,
Yeah.
how would you not be anxious?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, how would you not? Like, there's an aspect to our thoughts. Like, again, Elder Thaddeus, our thoughts determine our lives, but there's so much of what a person does. Like, I see people all the time, talk to people all the time in confession elsewhere, where I'm like, they've created all of this negativity, but they think it's all objective, and it's not objective. It's
Yep.
not. It is 100% coming from them and their thoughts.
Another thing I've noticed in my own maturation is, and we talked in the first stream that we did together, both of our past, but mine in regards to psychedelic usage, marijuana usage every day, drugs, pornography. And as I've grown, as God willing, as a man and the man that God wants me to be, I found that all these things that I used to find so pleasurable, when I've fallen back into temptation and then them again, especially after being an Orthodox Christian, they're never as good or as wonderful or as pleasurable as they once seemed. But the only thing that then gives me that sense of accomplishment or pleasure now is completing my daily tasks, is working. The only thing that allows me to sleep good at night is making sure I got the goals that I set for myself that day. And if I don't, then that's where the anxiety comes back in. And maybe then the tempestuous thoughts of, like you said, alleviating our emotions through pornography or masturbation or drugs or whatever it may be. The sins creep back in due to, really, from my own experience with my own life, is my failure to just take responsibility for the things that I have control of and accomplishing it for that day.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big theme, which, I have to talk about, which is, the devil doesn't want us in the present. The present is the only place where we can pray, right? So the devil is
Oh, I haven't heard
constantly
that one. I
taking
like
us.
that.
He's always taking us to the past, to regrets, to failures, to resentments. He's always either in the past or the future. And why? Because the past has already happened. You can't change it, right? And then the
Right.
future is uncertainty and a lot of potential unknowability, which can be anxiety producing if you're trying to control it.
Right.
And so you forget that you need to actually just live in the present. Even our Lord says this. He says today has enough anxiety of its own. Like like Christ understood that, like, in our human capacity, we don't really do better than one day at a time.
Right.
Like, we don't have a huge propensity for tackling all of tomorrow's problems today. It's an impossibility. And it'll drive people crazy. I mean, you see this mentally, it drives people bonkers.
Yep.
But you have to tell them, like, this is not reality. Reality is what is happening today. And there are measurable things that you can do today. And there are unmeasurable things that are going to happen today that are outside of your control.
Right. Because you made a video on women, I got a few questions. I'd love for you to go over some of the themes that you present in that video. I'm curious on your opinion on the importance of labor and finding a skill for a man to mature. Because one of the things that you mentioned in both your videos is that we as people of God have to be of service to others. And that part of the neoteny and part of the juvenile characteristics that we see is it's really about self-worship consumed with one's own pleasure and has nothing to do with the service or providing opportunities for other people around us. And so in my own research for my dissertation, I was completing my chapter this morning and talking about how technology, especially through the socialists in the 18th century, believed that technology was going to eliminate labor and that this was going to bring us to a utopian paradise. But my point was bringing back to patristic teaching that when Adam and Eve were casted out of the garden, man was forced to toil for it's clear, for the rest of his life, and women were going to experience the pain of birthing for the rest of their life. And we see technology, and especially the society we live in now, trying to alleviate these quote unquote burdens that God has placed on us for our own salvation. And I was curious what your thoughts are about the society we live in and young men struggling to find a purpose. And I try to always direct them towards a skill. You know, the purpose isn't necessarily this large plan where you're going to, you know, re-envision political landscape in America or change society so they're Orthodox Christians. It's like, well, what skill? There's your purpose. Where do you have a talent, a passion, and a skill set to offer other people?
Yeah, and I think that it's like it's natural for men to want to be heroes, right? I mean, there's kind of a natural component. It speaks to all of us. Like, it's just a reality. I think it's as natural to us as it is for women to be nurturers.
Right. So in a way, don't we find that in our families, though? I mean, isn't that the destination for men to feel that sense of a hero or a king in their own house, as somebody, you know, people like to phrase it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that is where you find it. But I think the problem that, again, where it's grossly misunderstood is, and this is one of those things why you have to hang out with older men, is you realize, like, it's a brutal grind. Like, it is not, you're not prancing around on a white pony, playing all your enemies and like having, you know, it's not a continual experience of being the victor. It is a very real and brutal grind. That's what it is. I mean, whether or not you're like writing code for a computer program or you're digging ditches for 10 hours a day, like there's a brutality to it that you have to accept as being part of a man. And unfortunately, because men are so noble, we have this sense of almost injustice where we're like, wasn't I created for more than this? Isn't my life more meaningful than this? Isn't there something more important I should be doing? And the reality is, no. 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 You're like, I realized, it's funny, like I realized this years ago, I would say when I was probably 36 or 37, and I like really came to this very deep, heartfelt conclusion, like that's what I am. Like I am stronger than everybody else. Not physically. I mean, physically I was not stronger than everybody else in some ways, but you know what I mean?
Right.
But I have a physical capacity to suffer that's disproportionate to everybody else around me. And in order for things to get done, I have to do them.
Right.
And so that's a humbling thought. I think that's a humbling thought because you're like, man, isn't there something more noble? And it's like, maybe go be a monk on Mount Athos. You know, like maybe there is, like you can sing in the choir and like pray and do whatever chores. And, you know, like it probably is it may be a more enjoyable experience than being a man and living in the world and providing for a family.
Right. Well, I think that's part of the maturation process is I've said before, it's really about a continuation of taking on more and more responsibility. And that we as men have to realize that that's not a game that you can avoid. And that if you really want ultimate meaning, I mean, this is why, as you talked about a beast of burden, Orthodoxy teaches us that suffering is a blessing. Suffering isn't something to avoid. And again, regarding my work with transhumanism, that's one of the largest impetus for the technology is to avoid all human suffering. And therefore, the machines are going to allow you to avoid that. Well, from our worldview, suffering in a way is a blessing because we grow from it just as a muscle grows from being stressed.
That's the way it is. Yeah, I mean, that's it. Adversity builds resilience. Adversity builds character. Like these are good things for us. We just don't like them. And I'm not any different than anybody else.
Sure.
I think you build up your mental resilience from going through difficulties that you would really rather not go through.
Right. Now, in regards to women, because you put out a video on women and how they move from being a girl to a godly woman, and this is something that I haven't seen a lot of clergy speak to women. Obviously, there's a huge influx of young men into the Orthodox Church, according to estimates, 70 to 75% of all new converts. But of course, when you talk about intersexual dynamics, contemporary dating, a lot of people want to point the blame to women with the OnlyFans, the promiscuity, the multiple sexual partners, all this different stuff is like, yeah, I know that, you know, us men are in a bad state, but look at the women. And you gave a list of 3 specific goals that a woman needs to analyze in regards to her own maturation. And the first one was finding her affirmation and attention from God. Could you speak a little bit to that? Because obviously attention is, you know, multiple academic studies have been done on women in social media, and attention and garnering attention is one of the main reasons why even secular leftist academics have said this is why women are so susceptible to social media, because they can garner so much attention, especially if they become more sexual.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things to think about, you know, when we talk about women or we talk about these things in general is like, there's a great quote another priest gave me one time, and he said, you know, women are unknowable and they can change at any time. There's always like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's one aspect. But I think that there's also, how can I put it? I think a lot of men don't understand themselves and have and really become rooted in themselves, so they're not able to see and appreciate what's distinct about women. So I think that is, you know, most guys are really, I mean, they're really not good with women. They just really are not. They don't understand it. They don't understand the dynamic. They don't understand the thought process, the uniqueness. I think a big part of maybe the big blind spot for men is that men are looking to make women into their image, and women do not fall into the categories that men do. And they don't fall into the thought process. They're not going to behave like us. They're not feminine version of men. They're completely different and separate on so many different levels. So that's a big part of it. But yeah, I mean, when we talk about the affection, affirmation, attention, it's the oxygen for women. Male attention is oxygen for women. They love it. I mean, it's like, that's their thing. Right. That is their thing, man. Like that is, if you were to ask what a woman's Achilles heel is, it is that right there.
Right.
Why does she have to find it from God? Well, she has to find it from God because if she doesn't, she's always going to be looking at it disproportionately from men. And twofold: one, men who are good at giving it to her are going to manipulate her for their own end, and she's not going to see it coming. It's a blind spot with women. Women are, it's ironic, women are very master. A friend's wife once said, women are master manipulators. So I'm not saying that. As a man, I'm not saying that. I was told that by a woman one time. I'll just leave it there. So women hypothetically are master manipulators, but the irony is they also tend to be manipulated in ways that they don't see coming. Right. So they want to overly trust or invest in men who they really shouldn't because of the way that men make them feel, and specifically certain men. Right. So right. A man who kind of makes a woman feel like he needs her, this is not appealing to women.
Right.
They don't want a needy man. They don't. Right. They want a man who chooses to give them attention.
Right.
And that they have to kind of work for it a little bit.
Right.
And they're willing to because it's more valuable to them. That attention from somebody who wouldn't normally give them attention, ooh, that's a higher level of cocaine than they're used to. You know what I mean?
Right. But what you mentioned in your video, this begins at a very, very early age in regards to young girls' relationship to their fathers, and that when women maybe don't grow up with their father or don't receive the correct attention, you know, this can be problematic into adulthood, and they're kind of staying in that same juvenile state where they're constantly trying to acquire male attention. And you mentioned this great story of a man who would come home and he would actually spend time with his daughters and his wife listening to them, which gets back to the conversation we just had 20 minutes ago about the men at the parish who can't speak with a woman. That part of the duty and the inner dynamic between men and women is to be able to sit and listen to them vent about their interior state and their emotional health or whatever it may be.
Yeah, and not try to fix them. Just take it in. Just let them be themselves. I mean, that's the thing, is like, men are really bad at trying to fix or change women. And it's just, it's not healthy to have that mindset. There's nothing, women are not inferior to men.
Right.
That's not our dynamic, and that's not our paradigm. A lot of times women will come to the right answers, or they, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, their emotions are so big that all they can hear is the emotion. And so you've got to give them 24 hours to air that out.
That's true.
And bring it down to an acceptable level. And then they can talk about the solution.
Right.
I was saying this to a guy the other day. I said, you have to understand how your wife works. I said, one of the things with my wife, there's an example, which is, if my wife feels overwhelmed by an upcoming event or something we have to do, she has to be able to say no. She has to. It is distressing to her if she cannot say no. So let's say the bishop is going to be in town. It's our parish feast day. It's vigil on Saturday night, and she's got to cook for Sunday, and she's got all, and she's overwhelmed, and she's like, she'll be like, I don't know if I can make it to vigil. If I go, you have to make it to vigil, the bishop's going to be there, blah, 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 blah. It does not work. Like, she cannot process all those emotions. It's too much. So I go, oh, okay, well, just do what you can do. 99% chance she'll be there. But she has to know, dude, she has to know that she can say that she's not going to be there, because then that gives her the room to kind of let all the emotions kind of gas off. And then when all the emotions have kind of aired themselves out and gone through the process, she's fine. But the thing is like, I'm not going to try to fix her and be like, you're too emotional, you know, like, stop being so emotional. Like, what am I going to say? There's nothing I can say to her, right? Like,
right.
Or say, you're not, you know what, sweetheart, you're in the middle of a crisis. Let me tell you.
Or provide a timeline of where she can accomplish all these things in a rational order. Like, that doesn't work either.
Well, I had a guy. This is, so there's, I won't tell the whole story, but there was somebody, and he was saying, basically, he said, yes, he's like, I have been telling my wife every day how she can get all this stuff done, the kitchen and the kids and all that. And I was like, uh-huh. And I go, how's that working out? And he's like, yeah, she's just pissed at me. I go, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm like, is it working? Like, is it working? That's the irony, is like, men will go, no. This is a great idea. It has to work. If you could just execute it how I'm telling you to execute it, it has to work. Instead of saying, like, it's not going to work with her, it doesn't fly, it isn't what she can handle, whatever else. You know what I mean?
Right.
And the thing is, too, as men, as the leaders, as being the ones that St. Paul says are stronger, we actually have to read where our wives are at strength-wise and adjust accordingly.
Right.
You know, we don't get to say, oh, you should just be better than that, or like, you should be more organized. I mean, you know, my wife, forgive me, like, I tell these stories about my wife, but they're in a very loving way. So I don't ever want anybody to think like, oh, I'm putting down my wife. But like, if the kitchen is messy and she's like, I've been juggling 5 kids today. Hypothetically, when she was juggling 1 child, the kitchen was also messy. Okay. So like, well, hypothetically speaking, the children and their numbers may not be the deciding factor. That's okay. That's okay. Because the thing is like, what do? We have to bear with each other in our strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
You know what I mean? And
right.
I'm not being a good husband if I begin to put pressure onto my wife to do and accomplish things that are outside of what she shows herself able to do. If she repeatedly shows herself unable to do these things, then I would be a terrible husband for assuming that she's magically going to be able to start doing it. And the other thing is too, if there's no static number, like there's no everybody's dynamic. Like I grew up, my mom, my mom, literally, this is not an exaggeration. My mom can probably do what the average 2 to 3 women can accomplish. I have no idea why. This is not even my observation. This is like other people. This is just how she is hardwired. So when I was growing up, it was like if you had dirty clothes, like you just left them by the washing machine and they would all be folded and put on your bed. And like that was a normal thing. And the kitchen was always spotless and the house was always spotless. And my mom worked full time. And if you needed something, she would cook it for you and blah, 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 blah. And I mean, she was like, you know, drink 6 cups of coffee in the morning and, you know, 4'8" and like just whacked out and just hitting and doing everything. It was just like, I thought that was normal. Like, you know, I thought, oh, this is just normal. Women are super highly effective. And it's like, no, there's a spectrum and women have different strengths and weaknesses. You know what I mean? So,
well, and it connects back with, because you're talking about some of the innate differences between men and women. And I was highlighting this recent study that came out, which was actually done by more progressively leftist oriented academics, but they were testing children, I believe around the ages of 2 to 3, and they would have boys and girls, and then they would put obstacles in front of the children as they began to try to walk or crawl. And they noticed that the boys, and this was like in the 90 percentile. So the vast majority of boys would try to figure out how to get around the obstacle. And the vast majority of the girls would sit down and then emotionally lament to the fact that there was an obstacle before them. And this connects, I wanted to connect it with your second point that you talked about for women, which was allowing a man to help them navigate their emotions. Because you talked about and you gave credence to women being intuitive and having an access to information about the world that men, we typically are oblivious to.
Correct.
But because of that gift that they do have, they can be also go in very strange directions if they navigate the world purely based on their sort of emotional intuition, if you will. Could you speak to some of the differences here between men and women, and why a woman, and why you advise a godly woman to find a good godly man to help them navigate their emotions?
Yeah. Women are not strategists. That's not what they're good at. It's just a fact of them. I mean, again, this is the one thing that people like pop up when they say things like, we need more men who are nurses. And it's like, women are natural nurses because of their empathy, their care, their attention to detail, their multitasking. We're terrible at multitasking. Nurses are running around doing 6 things at one time. Women are fantastic at this. We need more men in this area. It's like, it's not going to happen, right? It's not going to happen. Just like, what else do we see? Women are not strategists. When you look at the disproportionate numbers in chess, even people, what's her name? Edith Polgar. I think she's the highest rated chess grandmaster of all time. I mean, she was raised by her father with her sisters to all be chess masters. And she's the best, I think, out of 4 or 5 sisters. I mean, she is way below the best men. And it's not about getting a bigger sample size of women playing chess. It's the fact of the matter is that strategy, logical thinking, planning, execution, all these things are something that comes much easier to men than they do to women.
Right.
So what do we want to do in marriage? I think one of the things that somebody said to me many years ago, a mentor of mine said, was he said, you and your wife make the perfect parent. Not parents, the perfect parent.
One flesh.
And so, yes. And so I think continually when my wife has an insight about the boys, about what's happening, about how I'm doing something that's affecting them or whatever else, and she does, she has insights like, hey, you know, when you said this the other day, blah, 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 whatever else. I was like, oh, it was like spot on. You know what I mean? I can see very clearly that she has insights into me that I can just naturally, glaze over and ignore. Likewise, the strategy for getting things done, yeah, a lot of it has to come from the husband. It just does. It just does. So I guess some of these things, I treat them as if they're like common sense, but it's like, look, I mean, you can try to run a household and have your wife do certain things, but you're going to run into the roadblock that she's fantastic at some things and not great at other things. I mean, there's a reason that women homeschool and men don't homeschool. Like, I don't want to sit there and talk about math with a 5-year-old. Like, I don't, like, one, I'm not the most patient person. I wish
guilty as charged as well.
I wish in a miracle world I was more patient and whatever else. But guess what? God gave me a beautiful, wonderful helper who excels at talking to 5-year-olds about math. And so why would I try to be the math person for my kids when I have somebody who's far more competent at it than I am? It doesn't diminish me in any way. Right. And I think for my wife, she can see with scheduling and structure and authority and other things, those are the things that naturally come to the husband. And the thing is, too, is like, again, gender plays a part. I have 5 sons. So their natural disposition to their mom is that they love their mom and they're very affectionate towards their mom. But as far as hierarchy goes, they're not correct in this, but they believe that I am the head of the hierarchy and then they are next in line. Right. Like that's what they believe, even if you tell them that that's not true. You know what I mean? They're like, oh, we love our mom, but obviously, like, we're the second dogs in the pecking order, and you're like, no, you're not. You're boys. You come after your mom. But what they realize is mom gains her authority because of dad. If I undermine my wife's authority or criticize her or put her down or do whatever, the boys will just leap right over her. You want to see dynamics in a family is 100%. You want to know a real strong father? Look at how the kids talk to the mom. You can see so much of the dynamics of the family.
That's a great point.
By how the children, especially boys, speak to their mothers.
Right.
You know what I mean? In a family where the husband's more passive, the boys will be more aggressive with the mom and they'll speak to her more roughly. They'll not be as respectful. They'll have almost a disdain for her. Whereas when the husband is on his game, people, they don't get out of line because they realize like, oh, I'm not worried. They're not intimidated by her, just they're not going to be. Right. But they need to know that, like, look, there's a sheriff in town and there's a certain order to things. And the dad is going to keep that order and that harmony. And number one thing is like, look, no one's going to disrespect my wife.
Right.
It's not going to happen.
How does a man help his wife navigate her emotional landscape?
You show, number one thing for a man, this is true for every husband, and you're going through this when you get married, I can guarantee it, which is you have to prove to your wife that you love her more than you love yourself. And it takes an indeterminate amount of time. Every woman is different. I mean, I could do a whole video on this. This is 100% a real life observation, which is until a woman is convinced that you love her more than you love yourself, she will always have some, I don't want to say animosity towards you, but she will always have her guard up to a degree. She will always be sensing a need to protect herself. Remember, what is the curse in the garden? The curse is a woman's desire will be for her husband and he will lord it over her. Right? Every woman knows this. Even if they've never read the Bible, they know that this is true. So women know that they need and want that affection, attention, affirmation from men, but they also know, and this is where you get into the really jaded, feminist, damaged women, is they're like, men are swine, they're going to use all your natural desires and inclinations against you.
Right.
And so when you have a husband who's like, I adore you for you, and with all of my behavior, I show you that you're more important to me than I am to myself, it just, dude, it melts them. It just melts them. They're powerless. Your husband leaves for work at 6:30 in the morning and doesn't come home till after 5 and has been cooking out in the sun for 10 hours that day so that you can be provided for. Your wife knows, look, he's not doing that for himself. He's doing that because he loves me.
Right.
When she sees a husband who's sacrificial with his time, with his energy, with his attention, it gets her. When a wife knows her husband's not looking at pornography, other women, he doesn't have a fantasy life, he's not masturbating, he's not doing all these things, she knows that she's not opening herself up to a future betrayal.
Right.
The fear with women is always the fear of future betrayal and being taken advantage of. Every woman fears this on an almost intrinsic level. Now, depending on how damaged they are, it can be very serious, right? Now, depending on how good their dad was, this is a great, Tucker Carlson had this great thing the other day on an interview that I saw. And he said, basically, it's a lot easier to be married to a woman, or in my experience, women who love their dads are just a lot easier to have relationships with. And it's like, why is that? Because you're not guilty until proven innocent. When women have been taken advantage of, right? When they've been taken advantage of, abused, abandoned, hurt, damaged, they read into everything. They oversee everything. They psychoanalyze everything because they're trying to give themselves an advantage to protect themselves.
Right.
Whereas when women have good fathers, good father figures, good male figures who love them and take care of them, they don't have an animosity towards men. They have a natural kind of love and respect and honor for men. You see this a lot, dude, in the parishes with Russian women. A lot of Russian women had strong father figures.
Right.
And doesn't mean that all their fathers were saints, but they had strong father figures and strong roles. And I've just noticed with Russian women, they tend to have less animosity towards men.
Right. And
in families and in relationships where people didn't have that, they struggle much more with it. Because again, our fathers set up that role model scenario, and we build everybody else on that criterion of how our fathers were.
Right. No, I think that's beautiful. And the last point that you made for women to mature, to become godly women, is to be of service to other people and not be so selfish. And that's, as we've already highlighted, true for both men and women, and that the culture we live in is really constantly trying to get us to be selfish and just focus on our own pleasure. Could you speak to ways in which women can mature out of the sort of adolescent stage of selfish desire for male attention in all its various ways to actually being service to others and fulfilling that matured motherly, wifely role?
I mean, I think some of it is a natural process. I mean, just seriously, when women have babies, man, it just changes them. I think I think it's the same thing with men. It's very hard. It's very hard for a male to become a man without children. It just is, because nobody's depending on you. So like, you may feel like, oh, I have pressure, I have stress, I need to accomplish things, and all of that is true, but it completely changes when you have children.
Right.
The degree of responsibility just jettisons. And so the same thing is true with women, which is women have a natural inclination to these things, but until they're holding that little baby in their arms, it's a different experience, It's a very different experience. But when a mama holds that baby, it is life changing. It is life changing. Her priorities change, her attention changes, her, everything, her resilience, everything. Because, remember, there's aspects to women where they can be a bit self-indulgent with their emotions. And the reality is, when they have a baby or children relying on them every day, they learn really quick. Like, I can't just feed into all these emotions because there's other people here that are absolutely dependent on me to not overindulge my emotions.
Right.
So again, I think we forget that transformation happens in the face of adversity. And so there's a reason why we have families, we get married, we have children. That's where a lot of the changes come from. You can't manufacture these things without those particular stressors and experiences.
Right. Yeah, you kind of already hinted at. I have 3 concluding questions before anybody who has question or comments will get to those quickly. For Father Moses, if you have anything, feel free to send it in on Streamlabs, Dono Chat, or YouTube. Or if you're really feeling generous, gift some COTEL Crew memberships. The one that I was using, the question I had to try to connect our conversation about boys to men and then girls to women was exactly what you just concluded with, is the importance of family and marriage. And obviously, as Orthodox Christians, we view this as a salvational role, just as a monastic is to a monastery in his devotion and marriage to Christ, that we marry our wives, or for women, their husbands. And you are now owned by the other person, in a sense that your body is their body is now your body. And this is the fullness of this sort of defeating of selfishness and devotion towards somebody else for salvific purposes. Could you speak to maturation, and especially because, for those that are going to be monastics, okay, that's a different trajectory, that's a different life.
Sure.
But for the majority of people, they're going to try to find a partner to be married with. Can you speak to the importance of marriage and then having children as in this maturation process? Because we're looking, I mean, all Western societies are below replacement rate. People are not having children. Divorce is as high as it's ever been. People are now choosing not to get married at all and just living these sort of civil friendship unions where they're sexually active with each other. They go and have fun, but they're not committing to the family. Can you speak to marriage from an Orthodox perspective and the importance of children as an ultimate catalyst for both maturation for men and women?
Yeah, I think remember, everything comes back to the Garden of Eden. We always should be referencing Garden of Eden, because the blessing and the cursings and the transformation. But what does God say? He says, you'll cultivate the earth by the sweat of your brow.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You referenced that earlier.
Genesis 3.
That's right. There's a whole book by St. Paisios that I have that I should probably try to find a way to publish it, because nobody can find it. It's a pamphlet. But he basically says, look, most of the young men today are completely worthless. He's like, they don't work hard. No, he's like, they don't work hard. They're not sacrificial or whatever, all these things.
True. It's true.
Yeah. And he's like, the big thing, because this is repeated in numerous monastic texts, is that good monastics make good husbands, and good husbands make good monastics.
Oh, wow. I love
and
that.
The one thing that St. Pais, so when everyone says, oh, the paths are so radically different,
right,
I'm not convinced they are. In different ways, they have particular struggles.
Right.
But the consistent theme is hard work. And the thing is, left to our own devices, our propensity is for laziness.
Right.
And for not working hard. And it's just
true.
It's just, I've referenced this friend, my mentor, a few times, who was, when I was in my mid-20s, he was in his late 30s or whatever, mid-30s with 4 kids. And I remember I went to work for him, and he was a guy I knew through the church and whatever else, Protestant church at the time. And he said, oh, all right, well, just meet me at my house at 4:30 a.m. And I was like, okay. And I think that he really was like, he's not going to show, or he'll show a couple times or whatever else, because that's what had happened. And for whatever reason, I'm always very hardwired for commitment. So if I say I'm going to do something, I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I have a propensity to be focused on that. Right. So I went to work with him every day, man, for however long, 3-4 months during my summer, 3 months maybe. And we would work 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. We'd leave his house at 5 a.m. We drive down to the valley. We drive down to LA. We do all these repairs, leak location, all this different stuff. And then we would come home and be home at 5 o'clock back at his house. And I remember his wife saying to my wife, she's like, basically, she goes, Moses does a lot better when he's working 12 hours a day. He was like, he's in a much better place. And I realized, like, that's not a bad thing, right? It's not a bad thing to say the way that I'm hardwired needs more work. Like there are, and I think I've said this before, but there are working dogs. And one of it's so funny. People will buy these working dogs, whatever, that are like cattle herding dogs. That dog is bred to doing 10 miles or whatever a day.
Right.
Somebody buys that dog and they walk it 2 times around the block, a quarter mile at night, and they go, man, this dog is uncontrollable.
It's too hyperactive.
It's too hyperactive. It's like, no, it's a working dog. It needs 10 miles a day to be healthy.
Oh, my neighbors, great people, but they have herding dogs, and that they love the long. It's like the miniature lassie. It's like I forget the name of the breed, but it's kind of like a collie looking dog, and they just bark they never get walked. They don't, there's not a whole other than throwing the Frisbee a few times. And so they're just such a nuisance because they have so much energy that's not unleashed, that's not put towards anything.
It's just like, but see, that's how it is, especially as a man. I mean, it changes. It definitely changes as you get older. I still work a lot of hours. It's not as physical as it used to be, just by the nature of what I'm doing. But the fact of the matter is, you just need to put a lot of hours in. It's not bad. Like, it's not bad. If somebody said, oh, what would you rather be a little unbalanced in what direction? I would always say, if you're young and you're unbalanced working too much, it's going to keep you from some other sins. If you work 40 hours a week, it's going to leave you with a lot of time on your hands to get into a lot of problems that you don't need to get into. Like, you're better off just working a ton.
That's a great point that we hadn't mentioned in regards to the passive free time, and too much free time is what is the quote? There's a quote like paraphrasing something about too much free time is the idle ground of the devil.
Idle hands are the devil's playground.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah. St. Joseph the Hezekiah had a variation on that. He said, basically, the devil's taught people with idle hands many things. And it's true. I mean, it's true. So what's funny is that, like, so for me, it was funny because this mentor's wife, and she's still very dear to me. I mean, we're still friends, everything else. But she was like, he's the type of guy who needs this. Like, he's not mentally balanced without this. And so I think that we forget, like, we kind of need to wear ourselves out a bit in life, and your perspective changes too. Like, I'll say this, because this has been hitting me out really heavy lately, which I'll be 43 this year in a couple months. And it's like, when you're young, life is like this thing that's open. It's an adventure. It's this whole thing. There's lots of possibilities. And of course, which is the case, you have a gang of kids and whatever thing else and responsibility.
You got a starting 5 over at your house.
Huh?
I said, you got a starting 5 at your house.
Yeah.
You got a basketball team.
Pretty much all point guards. But anyway, the thing is that life just like hems you in. But then you come to a point in your life where you start to see it as more of like, life is more of a waiting room. Like, life is not about this life. Life is about the next life. And I mean, I've thought about this quote for years from St. John Chrysostom, where he says the Christian trades this life for the next life. Right. So all the paganism in our culture wants to get the most out of life. They don't want to give the most of their life. They want to get out of life what they think is owed to them.
Yeah, that's
and
a great
for us,
point.
it's the total opposite.
Right.
We're savages. We want to give as much to this life as possible. Right. So that we can have a good, we can have a good defense before the judgment seat of Christ.
Amen.
So I was thinking about this, and I don't mean this as like, I don't mean this as a pat on the back, but this is the sort of stuff that really gets me fired up, which is, so I was competing on Saturday in powerlifting, and then so my third squat was 580. I went down into the hole, and my adductor, my inner thigh just popped. I mean, I felt it pop. I lost all power.
Could you hear it? I've heard people being able to hear it.
I didn't hear, but it was so just so distinct right in my thigh, Anyways, and then I'm like, okay, now what do I do? And I'm like, all right, well, that's the end of the day.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna be lifting. I had so much adrenaline, and I was feeling so strong that I was like, I'm not gonna be able to do anything else. I'm not gonna be able to bench, whatever else. I'm not gonna deadlift. So I was like, well, I'm just gonna go home and DQ myself and go home and whatever else. But then I was thinking, okay, well, what's tomorrow? And I'm like, tomorrow's Pentecost, and then it's Pentecost and the kneeling prayers, and I can barely walk, like I'm hobbling around. And there's part of me as a man that's like, this is kind of fun. Like, it's kind of fun. It's a kind of a bit of a challenge. Like, what are you going to do? Like, you're going to call in sick and like nobody's going to have communion, and you're not going to celebrate Pentecost because your leg is mangled. You know what I mean? You're like, no, you're like, we're going to do the services. Like, it's going to be brutal. Like, it's not like it's going to be brutal. But there's part of you that goes like, but I kind of dig it, because it's like, it's a lot harder than it would be,
Yeah.
And even getting down for the kneeling prayers. I mean, I was just like reading the kneeling prayers as quick as I could, because I was like,
those are long prayers too.
I was like, this is very uncomfortable. Let's just say it's like very, very uncomfortable. And then there's something to that, there's something to being a man and just doing man things and pushing yourself mentally and being uncomfortable that I don't know, man. I love it. I love being a man. I love that stuff. I genuinely embrace that. Like, that's good, man. Like, that's how God made us. Like, he wants us to be like that. That's a good thing. He doesn't want us to take the easy way out and whatever else, blah, blah, blah. And like,
That's why the path is narrow.
Yeah. And then, and then ironically, then we had to install a cupola.
I know, you sent me that photo. I said, dude, you're nuts.
So I just went up there. We worked on it. But
it's on the roof.
Yeah, like hobbling around on the roof. It was so dumb too, because it was way too hot. I probably was like borderline dehydrated. I'm hobbling on the roof. Probably could get injured worse. But anyways, there's something about being a man and just embracing these things that makes you feel alive, and it's enjoyable. Like, it's genuinely enjoyable. Like, pushing through the mental barriers and everything else, like, and not quitting when your body tells you to. Yeah. Like,
well, and at a larger macro level, what I take from what you're saying is also, avoiding complacency and comfort and enjoying the journey that every man is. So just like when we're connecting it back with anxiety I feel about my professional career or future or how I'm going to provide for everything, that is exciting though, right? That's what gets me up in the morning to make sure I get my work done, and that there's an sense of excitement about I don't want to call it suffering, but certainly the pain of the journey itself.
Yeah. The adversity.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's no, you know what I'm saying? There's nobody walks to the end of their block and go, wow, that was very rewarding. I overcame adversity. You know what I mean? But like, you throw a ruck on your back with 35 pounds and do a couple miles in the Texas heat. And you're like, that was legit. Like that pushed me someplace mentally to go someplace I wouldn't normally want to go.
Right.
So,
go ahead. Did you want to say something?
Oh, that's it, man.
Okay. Well, my last two questions, and these are kind of quick. Well, you're talking about comfort, and I wrote these down. I was curious on your thoughts, and maybe you don't feel the same, but there's certainly been articles, and I've done streams talking about the casual dress culture. And so Silicon Valley has sort of popularized this about doing away with formal attire, or just the aesthetics of history itself, and was relating this to creating more comfortable environments. You can wear sweatpants and stuff like this. And we see the ways in which people present themselves in public becoming, people. I was just at the store today getting groceries, and there's people in pajama pants. And I was curious what your thoughts were in regards to this casual dress society, how does that, maybe it doesn't in your view, but how does it relate to maturation? Because I feel like there has to be some connection there. When especially like my grandparents, even when they're older age, always dressed very nice when they were going to go out in public, because this was part of how they viewed the way society should work and the way that they engage with other people. Do you think there's a connection there? What are your thoughts on the sort of casual dress society that we live in now?
It's hard, I'm so poisoned from growing up in Southern California that, like, if you're wearing like flip-flops and a pair of shorts, like, that's acceptable. I think I'm just so used. I think the two areas that I would draw a distinction, obviously, would be like going to church. I think what you wear when you go to church defines how you value going to church.
Mm,
I think that would be something that's a pet peeve for me personally as a priest, which is like people wearing pants that are frayed at the bottom, or like shoes that are falling apart, or like wearing a t-shirt. God forbid somebody shows up in shorts. It's
I
just
was going to ask you, would you let a man in shorts be there for the liturgy,
you know,
or
I
even take Eucharist?
I don't know if I would let them receive communion if they were wearing shorts. I don't know. It depends. I don't think I've kicked anybody else for wearing shorts. I don't know. I don't know if we have a diocese actual like proclamation on that. But occasionally, I mean, we're in Texas, so occasionally someone will show up, wearing a polo shirt and a pair of shorts. Obviously, if I can talk to them, I'll tell them,
Right,
we don't normally wear that, blah, blah, blah. And most of the time it's people whose first time at church, or they just
right.
don't understand church culture. Um, so, but I guess I feel strongly about it in regards to church. That's where I feel strongly is how we view the church, you know, dictates our dress code. Is it a serious and solemn environment?
Right.
People used to wear three-piece suits to go on an airplane flight.
Right.
Obviously we don't do that anymore. I'm certainly not opposed to people who want to dress like. I think there's, you ever listen to that Guy Ritchie rant that he did on Joe Rogan regarding suits?
Yes.
I
Yes.
love that.
I thought it was fantastic.
It's
Yeah.
awesome. It's
It's your
fantastic.
uniform. It's your uniform as a man.
I
And that's
if
where
I
I was
could, yes, if I
and
had
that's
the
what I was go ahead, go ahead.
no, I was just saying, if I had the discipline and the need and the money and everything else to wear that, yeah, like that's. I think he makes the best points regarding that. Um, I just think that I think it's just I think what we have to be careful about is just being lazy.
Right.
It's more like the sloppiness, laziness of just not caring about one's appearance, more so than I would say it's any one, kind of thing.
Right.
So
Yeah, I just was
yeah,
curious on your thoughts, because my dad, he's a military guy and he still dresses very nice when he goes out in public. And so growing up, for the way that he always conditioned me was, this is what, when you become a man, you have to dress a certain way compared to, the way I dressed as a kid. And now as an adult, that's still and that's still within me, especially when I go to church or I go to, nice public place. But I just look at the culture around us, and I felt like there's certainly some type of connection where there is no transition in appearance from adolescence and adulthood. Not that we need to overemphasize materiality or the way people dress or the brands they use, nothing like that, but just a sense of self-worth and professionalism doesn't seem to be to the same degree as
no,
earlier in the
I get
20th.
it. I mean, I get it. I get it. I think it's part of a mindset that is very foreign to our culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of like guys, like, I'm in my 40s, but it's like a guy in his 40s who's like still wearing um like a skateboarding t-shirt or something.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care. I guess I don't really care. I'm kind of like whatever, but like I get it that it's like there's aspects of your youth that you're trying to hold on to. Yeah. So if you're asking me what my preference is, obviously, like, I love what Guy Ritchie said. I think that's fantastic. His insight.
Right.
I think, most men would agree that the way that James Bond dresses and presents himself is part of not his overall mystique, but his overall sense of basically being put together.
Right.
right? And I think it's the same thing. Like I grew up reading a lot about like the mafia, and that was like a big influence on me growing up, was that culture. But that culture was very much about how you present yourself, was always looking good. So I do think that there's a healthy, normal sense in which that doesn't have to cross over to, you know, vanity and you know, whatever,
Right.
self-love, that is just about dressing in a normal, presentable way. Again, anything can go off the rails. I mean, you know,
Right.
but yeah.
So, and then my concluding question, which was related to my relationship with my dad and more formal dress wear, was to conclude our conversation on adult children and the failure to mature, both men and women. What is the role of the father? Because we've mentioned this and you've mentioned this multiple times throughout today's conversation about the father, whether it be attention for the young girl or a role model for the young men. Can you speak to the immaturity that arises from people that never grow up with a father or with a strong father figure?
Yeah, I don't, you know, that's a hard question, man. You know, I think, I mean, maybe I would lean on that quote from Fight Club where he says, you know, our fathers are our role models for God. I think there's certainly something to that. I think it's so hard to say because to pin down exactly what a father is so unique to each person's father.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So like they're a role model, they're a protector, they give you an identity because you're made in their image. Like that's a big one.
Yeah, literally.
Um, I don't know. I don't know. I really have to think about that. Like, what is a father? Like, I don't know. He's the disciplinarian. He's the authority. He's the head of the family.
Right. Well, when we look at um, cultures within, let's say, the United States, where father absence is the majority, and you talked about the inability to control one's emotions, acting out in violence, that these seem to be ways in which the absence of a male role model or father figure or biological father, um, men are becoming more like women in a general sense, because the boundaries, we've talked about that with masculinity before, the boundaries, the discipline, the respect amongst other men, and the selflessness of doing something that's greater than oneself. I think those are some of the things that I took from my dad, in regards to, you know, constantly working, even as a retired, like he always has to have something that he has to work on. There's always a goal to be done. There's always something that needs to be accomplished. Discipline, focus on the future, responsibilities over pleasure. These were things that I witnessed through my father that informed my own life. So I don't know. I was just throwing that out there as a concluding question in regards to when we see father absence and we see the rates of divorce and we see the destruction of the nuclear family and we see the rise of antinatalism, it seems like fathers and fatherhood is one of the first things on attack. And it doesn't seem to be elevated or held to be an important role in our society anymore. And I think that it may contribute to the neoteny and the immaturity that we see.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think, yeah, I think that's hard. Is that like to pin down exactly what a father is difficult because I think they
Mm-hmm.
just fulfill so many different, or they inform so many different aspects of the child's upbringing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
not
that's a
just
great.
one thing. Like
Right.
they are the standard of what's acceptable.
Right. Yeah.
That's one of them, right? Like you don't
That's
get
a
that
great
from,
point.
like you don't get that from your mom,
No.
right? They're not nurturers in the typical sense that a mother will be, although they mature you. Their affirmation and approval is more valuable to you than anybody else's in the world,
Yeah. And
essentially.
that was my experience growing up with my dad, especially once I got into middle school and high school playing sports, is the validation I got from my father was the highest validation I could get.
Yeah.
And that's what, you know, it wasn't until later when I gave up basketball in college and focused on academics, but that was why sports were so central to my own identity and who I was, because that's how I garnered favor and attention and accomplishment in the eyes of my father particularly. And that was huge for how I viewed myself. That if my father appreciated what I was doing and saw me moving in the right direction, then I knew that I was moving in the right direction.
Yeah, you know what's interesting is I find this a lot with the Twitter crowd, with the comment sections, with what people say is like they're very unmoored from reality. They're unhinged from reality. And so a lot of times, like, there's a lot of fantasy and idealism and different things, and like, you know, but I find they're not, they live in something that's not reality, and they don't understand, like, they fundamentally do not understand or have interacted with like actual men. So, which is not abnormal, right? I mean, our society does not produce men.
Right.
Our society has males. Some of those males are fathers. Most of those males are not men. That's just a
True.
reality.
True.
I mean, it is. I mean, it's funny. There's a story in with one of the church fathers where it was one of the bishops, and the local ruler said, "Hey, you have to do this thing." And he's like, "Look, I'm not doing it." And he's like, "I'll kill you." And he's like, "I don't care if you kill me." And he's like, he goes, "You're not like the other bishops." And he goes, "I don't think you've ever met a real Christian bishop before then." And so I noticed that a lot with guys, which is they just don't they simply do not understand real male masculine culture, because they simply put do not have real men around them.
Right.
They just don't. And they don't understand, they do not understand the basics of male culture, because they were not raised around men. They were not, the internet is not full of men.
Right.
It's not. Real men are not spending their time debating Catholicism versus Orthodoxy. You know what I mean? Like, some people can do that, right? And can answer questions, but there are literally guys that it's like a sport, and all they do is just try to dunk on each other. Like, this is not male culture. It's just not. You know what I mean? Answer questions, sure. Help people out, resolve things, sure. But kind of like using intellectual witticism to like one up the other guys around you, that's not male culture.
Right.
It's just not. I mean, it's not. You know, when you're a man, you have real stuff to do. It's not interesting to you.
Right.
So, anyways, I think there's a lot that could be said about that, but I do think that, like, I do think guys are very unhinged from male culture, period. And, you know, honestly, some of that is even in the church. Forgive me, but it's true.
Well, it's true. And I think that, to conclude, and we'll get into the super chats real quick and I'll let you go, is that I think that's part of what at least my father and my own experience always brought me back to reality. So, you know, his expectations and to achieve validation from him was never inside of a fantasy or never inside of a digital world. It's about real things. And so I think that's one of the things that a good father instills in children, but especially young boys, is an attachment, not an unhingement to reality and understanding like how things actually work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just answer a few super chats real quick. Over on the Dono chat, Blue Skittle throws in $5, says, "So much wisdom in this stream. Thank you." Well, thank you very much, Blue Skittle. God bless you, brother. Really appreciate it. Seabass throws in $5, says, "Thanks for hosting cool people and talking about important topics." Well, thank you very much, Seabass. And over on the Streamlabs, I think we had a few specific questions. Back in my right mind, 88 says, "Hey, Patrick, keep up the good work. My grandson, 19, is super immature. He is a serial perpetuant gamer living in his dad's basement. I pray for him daily." And this is coming, I know who this lady is. So she's in her 70s. She's a grandmother. And she's very active in the Orthodox community. So shout out to Back in My Right Mind. You know, hopefully your grandson will be able to mature from that state. Sojourner throws in a generous $25. Thank you very much. He says, "Elder Christopher of Tula said that the Antichrist was just around the corner in rarely blessed marriages. Do you think we are past the point of worrying about the continuation of the human race?" So I think that's aimed towards you. I think I already know your answer on that, but
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this line of reasoning that, I'm not familiar with anything official or any recent saints that encourage people not to get married. I mean, so I would say, when people ask St. Paisios about this, St. Paisios said that, just like the early Christians, they kept marrying and having children in the face of persecution and death.
right.
So he said basically we should do the same.
And recently I've been diving a lot more into eschatology and translations of the saints, and regarding the question of not getting married because the Antichrist is around the corner, I never saw that from the saints. From my research, I've done multiple streams, did one with Father Peter Hears. They all tell us that we are supposed to live our lives as Christians whether or not the Antichrist is present. And
Yeah,
and the perpetuation of families and having children is part and parcel of that lifestyle. And St. Paisios, mentioning him, and multiple saints have said that after this great war, there's going to be a blossoming of orthodoxy around the world. It's going to be a golden age. So even and the Antichrist, according to our own timeline, according to the wisdom of the church, the Antichrist is after this golden age. So I don't understand the timeline. I don't understand the mysteries of God, but according to what I've read from the church and saints like Elder Ephraim, St. Paisios, they tell us that we should get married, we should live Christian lives, we should have children, and that God's will be done either way. But for us to avoid our Christian duties out of fear, that sounds like a sin.
Yeah, and I mean, just for reference, I mean, the same thing popped up, in Father Seraphim Rose's day 50 years ago, where people were, telling him, look, it's the world is going to collapse. I mean, think about and people forget, obviously, like you had Stalin, you had the greatest persecution of Orthodox Christians. I mean, you had so much, life was way crazier 50 years ago than it is now. And Father Seraphim Rose was adamant. He just told people, you just need to kind of put your head down and do what's necessary and not assume that it is the end times or whatever else. And now look at that wisdom. It's been 50 years since then.
Right.
So Absolutely. We really have no clue on these things.
Right. Shout out to DC Woodworking, throws in $2, no comment. Joshua Schmidt throws in $5, says rotisserie chicken at HEB is like $5. Has at least a few meals in it. Not bad. That was from when you were commenting about how difficult it is to find a good meal. And
Shout
then
out to HEB.
And regarding that point too, Dr. Crispy said a man's job is to emotionally regulate his woman.
Yeah, I don't know if I would. I mean, good luck with that. I don't know. I don't know how effective that's going to be, but good on you if you can manage that. I think it's more to, as we say, bear each other's burdens.
Right.
You know what I mean? And thus fulfill the law of love.
Right. Well, and as you mentioned, it's first acquiring the trust from your wife.
Yeah.
To be somebody that would help navigate their emotional landscape.
Yeah. Yeah. And and to love her, and there's gonna be a little bit up and down. That's all right.
Yeah, that's normal.
For.
Pinnacle Auto Care throws in $10 and says, highly recommend a manual labor business for those looking for direction. I started detailing RVs at 18 and matured tremendously in 2 to 3 years of working in 100-degree heat every day, and you meet great people. So yeah, I think that's great advice.
And people forget, like, it's not that crazy, especially when you're young, to find these jobs that businesses people are selling and other things that you can buy and get into, where you can make, in your early 20s, mid 20s, you're not going to make, nobody's going to give you $100,000 salary unless you're very specialized and very talented in something. But if you are willing to put in a couple of years in the trades, I mean, I know guys who did 2-3 years as plumbers and then had their own service truck, were making sales, were making repairs and overtime and making over $100,000 a year.
Yep. I know somebody personally that did exactly that.
Yeah. Yeah, or buying your own business, detailing, pressure washing business, all those different things.
Yep.
So, and there is a reason that starting your own business, pouring all your time and energy into it was the American dream, because it paid off hugely. And right now there's more boomers who are retiring and selling these businesses and whatnot. If you can get into them, even having them finance them. I know it's a separate topic, but if you're able to do that, you can stay out of the corporate American lifestyle. You can own your own business. You don't have to submit to the Alphabet and Skittles and everything else, and you can do your own thing.
Right. Amen. And then the last super chat we have comes from Eli Hernandez, throws in $5. Thank you very much, Eli. He said, I had an absent and abusive father during my childhood. At 33, I can definitely say I really needed a father figure. My life would have been different. So,
yeah, I mean, coulda, woulda, shoulda. I mean, me too, but that's life.
And that gets back to your video about boys becoming men and containing and moving beyond trauma, pain,
Yeah, I mean, it's just
suffering.
like, yeah, I mean, the main thing is whatever age you're at, to find older men. They don't have to replace your dad. That's okay. You can have a relationship with God that is the true relationship of father and son that you didn't get when you were a kid. And you can focus your time and energy on developing and cultivating your relationship with older men, and they'll teach you and guide you and direct you. You
Right.
ask a million questions, you constantly ask for direction. I mean, man, people don't have any idea. I mean, I've spent so many in my mid 20s with my mentor. I mean, I've spent hundreds of hours on the phone asking him about marriage, about my wife, about what to do, about this, that, the other. You know what I mean? Why? He's the closest thing I've ever had to a dad, you know?
Right.
So,
Right.
I mean, I didn't have a dad, but I have this guy and he's great and I love him. So why would I not rely on him? He's got a good life and his life reflects his character,
Right.
So, yeah.
And I think and you would know better, but I assume for some of the young men, since so many young men are becoming Orthodox, that's also a role that the priest fills for potentially some of these men that didn't have a fatherly figure in one way or another.
Yeah. I mean, sure. As long as sure.
All right. Well, Father,
I mean, I'm just saying that sometimes you'll meet guys in the church that are just guys in the church. You got guys in the church who are solid guys.
yeah.
Look at their marriage, look at how they treat their wife, look at how their kids behave, etc., etc. They may not be the intellectual juggernaut, whatever else, but they're solid. They're solid. They love their wives respect them. That's the number one thing you want to look for.
Yep.
You want to look for a man who is solid, reliable, whose wife respects him. You know that he's going to have a good relationship with God just based on those things. He doesn't have to be an academic. He doesn't have to be, a debater. He doesn't have to be, an intellectual giant. It's not important. Wisdom and intellect do not always go hand in hand, let me tell you.
Right.
And a lot of times you can meet somebody who's blue collar, who's really solid, who will have far more profound direction and understanding about marriage than somebody who is educated.
Right. Well, Father, anything you want to tell people before we hop off here? Again, I got your YouTube link, your X account, and your Instagram in the video description. So everybody go follow Father Moses on those platforms if you'd like to hear more and just keep up to speed with everything he's up to. Any concluding comments before we hop off here?
The biggest thing I would say is don't should on yourself. Don't should on yourself. Don't look at where you're at and say, oh, I should have done this 5 years ago, or I'm 30, or I'm this age, or I'm that age, or I've got this or that, whatever adversity, whatever else. Don't do it. Like wherever you're at, it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the effort and the work that you're willing to put in. Right. And so if you're like, man, I'm so far behind, it's like, I get it. I mean, I could tell you lots of embarrassing things about my life and my failure to launch and my immaturity in my 20s. It's not important where you come from. Obviously, I didn't have a father figure, et cetera, et cetera. Like none of that stuff matters and none of it defines you. the number one thing I would say is do the work.
Right.
Like if you do the work, if you pursue making progress, you will make progress. And it doesn't matter how old you are when that happens, just stinking put in the work. That's all that matters.
Right. Julius Caesar didn't start accomplishing his military feats till in his 40s. So keep that in mind.
People often think they've wasted so much time or they've lost, that they've lost whatever. And it's like, you didn't lose your childhood. It's gone. It's already over with. So at this point, all you can do is move forward. So don't look at, all the things you've screwed up and whatever else. That's not important. Like if you're like, oh, I'm a screw up, it's like, great. That's why we are in the church. Like that's
exactly. That's why. That's exactly why we're all in the church.
Oh, whatever you did, however things in life has been unfair or whatever else, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. The only thing that matters is do the work.
Right. Amen. Well, Father, thank you so much for another great conversation. I'm sure this will be insightful to men and women who watch this into the future. So thank you again for all your work. Guys, make sure you go subscribe, support Father Moses. And also, if you want to directly support him and his family, you can check out his Patreon channel. I believe you started Patreon. And so you can contribute to his work online and his online ministry. So thank you guys again. Smash that like. And I'll see you guys later in the week. As always, until then, God bless.